The dusty streets of Dry Creek carried whispers as easily as the wind carried sand. Clara walked with her head low, skirts brushing the dirt road, the weight of every step heavier than the last. People didn't need to speak loudly. She could feel their words cutting into her back like sharp knives. The dusty streets of Dry Creek carried whispers as easily as the wind carried sand. Clara walked with her head low, skirts brushing the dirt road, the weight of every step heavier than the last. People didn't need to speak loudly. She could feel their words cutting into her back like sharp knives. That's the cursed girl. Her own fiancé ran from her. She'll never be wanted. She had learned to keep her eyes on the ground. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shut out the sting of their voices. Clara had been born into a family that considered her more burden than blessing. Her father had a hard hand and a harder heart, and her mother's silence hurt worse than any slap. "You're weak," they used to say, good for nothing but pity. As a child, she had believed them, swallowing every cruel word until they became the marrow of her bones. By the time she was a woman grown, her heart already carried scars the eye couldn't see. But there were scars the eyes could see, too. One cut across her cheek from a fall she had taken years ago, a permanent reminder of pain she hadn't asked for. Some said the scar was why her fiancé left her the night before their wedding. Others claimed it was her bad luck, that marrying her would curse any man's future. Clara didn't know which lie was worse, but she knew one thing. The shame of being abandoned still burned hotter than the desert sun. She sat outside the mercantile, clutching the edge of her shawl, trying to stay invisible. The town of Dry Creek was small, but its cruelty was wide enough to stretch for miles. 2 women passed, their parasols tilted just enough to hide their smirks. "Poor thing," one whispered, loud enough for Clara to hear. "Not even fit to be a wife. Who'd want her now?" Clara pressed her lips together, refusing to cry where they could see her. Tears were just another weakness for them to laugh at. The memory of her fiancé's departure haunted her most. His words still echoed, "I can't do this, Clara. I need a life without shame." He hadn't even looked back as he mounted his horse and rode into the night, leaving her in a wedding dress no one would ever see. The image of the wagon wheels fading away into darkness stayed carved in her mind like an open wound. That night had marked the death of hope, the night she truly began to believe what everyone else already thought, that she was unwanted, unworthy, unlovable. She tried to survive in silence, taking odd jobs, mending clothes, scrubbing floors, tending sick animals. Work kept her hands busy but her soul empty. In the evenings, she sat by the single lantern in her small rented room, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Her scar caught the light, and her own eyes accused her, useless, broken, alone. Some nights, she wondered if God himself had turned his face away. Clara dreamed of escape, of leaving Dry Creek behind. But where could she go? A lone woman with no dowry, no family support, and a reputation already ruined had little chance in a world where survival belonged to the strong. She was trapped by her roots, bound to a place that never wanted her, a ghost in her own hometown. Still, something stubborn flickered inside her, faint as a candle in the wind. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was survival, maybe just a desperate need to prove them wrong. She didn't know what kept her moving each day when every voice around her told her she should give up. But that faint spark, though weak, refused to die. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the dusty hills, Clara walked past the saloon where laughter and music spilled out into the street. Men leaned on railings, their eyes sliding over her before turning away, as if even looking at her might bring bad fortune. One drunk snickered, "There goes the cursed bride," and the others laughed with him. Clara tightened her shawl around her shoulders, quickening her pace. The road stretched ahead, long and lonely, and she had never felt smaller in her life. Inside her, pain swirled with exhaustion, and she whispered to herself, "Maybe they're right. Maybe I was never meant for love." Her words vanished into night air, carried off by the desert wind. And yet, as she disappeared into the shadows of her rented room, the story of her life was about to shift. For though she did not know it yet, someone else, a man scarred by his own grief, a cowboy who lived more in silence than in speech, was about to cross her path. And in that meeting, the broken roots of her past would begin to entwine with something stronger. For the first time in years, Clara's life was about to change. That's the cursed girl. Her own fiancé ran from her. She'll never be wanted. She had learned to keep her eyes on the ground, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shut out the sting of their voices. Clara had been born into a family that considered her more burden than blessing. Her father had a hard hand and a harder heart, and her mother's silence hurt worse than any slap. "You're weak," they used to say, good for nothing but pity. As a child, she had believed them, swallowing every cruel word until they became the marrow of her bones. By the time she was a woman grown, her heart already carried scars the eye couldn't see. But there were scars the eyes could see. Two. One cut across her cheek from a fall she had taken years ago, a permanent reminder of pain she hadn't asked for. Some said the scar was why her fiancé left her the night before their wedding. Others claimed it was her bad luck, that marrying her would curse any man's future. Clara didn't know which lie was worse, but she knew one thing: the shame of being abandoned still burned hotter than the desert sun. She sat outside the mercantile, clutching the edge of her shawl, trying to stay invisible. The town of Dry Creek was small, but its cruelty was wide enough to stretch for miles. Two women passed, their parasols tilted just enough to hide their smirks. "Poor thing," one whispered, loud enough for Clara to hear. "Not even fit to be a wife. Who'd want her now?" Clara pressed her lips together, refusing to cry where they could see her. Tears were just another weakness for them to laugh at. The memory of her fiancé's departure haunted her most. His words still echoed. "I can't do this, Clara. I need a life without shame." He hadn't even looked back as he mounted his horse and rode into the night, leaving her in a wedding dress no one would ever see. The image of the wagon wheels fading away into darkness stayed carved in her mind like an open wound. That night had marked the death of hope, the night she truly began to believe what everyone else already thought, that she was unwanted, unworthy, unlovable. She tried to survive in silence, taking odd jobs, mending clothes, scrubbing floors, tending sick animals. Work kept her hands busy but her soul empty. In the evenings, she sat by the single lantern in her small rented room, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Her scar caught the light, and her own eyes accused her. Useless. Broken. Alone. Some nights, she wondered if God himself had turned his face away. Clara dreamed of escape, of leaving Dry Creek behind. But where could she go? A lone woman with no dowry, no family support, and a reputation already ruined had little chance in a world where survival belonged to the strong. She was trapped by her roots, bound to a place that never wanted her, a ghost in her own hometown. Still, something stubborn flickered inside her, faint as a candle in the wind. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was survival, maybe just a desperate need to prove them wrong. She didn't know what kept her moving each day when every voice around her told her she should give up. But that faint spark, though weak, refused to die. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the dusty hills, Clara walked past a saloon where laughter and music spilled out into the street. Men leaned on railings, their eyes sliding over her before turning away, as if even looking at her might bring bad fortune. One drunk snickered, "There goes the cursed bride," and the others laughed with him. Clara tightened her shawl around her shoulders, quickening her pace. The road stretched ahead, long and lonely, and she had never felt smaller in her life. Inside her, pain swirled with exhaustion, and she whispered to herself, "Maybe they're right. Maybe I was never meant for love." Her words vanished into night air, carried off by the desert wind. And yet, as she disappeared into the shadows of her rented room, the story of her life was about to shift. For though she did not know it yet, someone else, a man scarred by his own grief, a cowboy who lived more in silence than in speech, was about to cross her path. And in that meeting, the broken roots of her past would begin to entwine with something stronger. For the first time in years, Clara's life was about to change. The morning sun burned down on Dry Creek, painting the town in shades of gold and dust. Clara walked to the main street, shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the wooden planks beneath her feet. She hated coming into town, hated the whispers that followed her like shadows. But she needed flour and soap, and survival often demanded facing humiliation head-on. Near the well, a cluster of townsfolk had already gathered. As Clara passed, the air shifted. Snickers, hushed words, louder this time, meant to sting. There she goes, the cursed bride. Another voice, sharp as a whip. Her own man didn't want her. What does that tell you? The laughter that followed was cruel and hollow, but it cut through Clara all the same. She bit her lip, willing herself not to cry. She was about to hurry past when one of the men stepped in her way. His boot scuffed the dust, his smirk wide. "Tell me, girl," he drawled, "how much for your bad luck? Maybe I could use it." The others roared with laughter. Clara's stomach twisted, her cheeks burning. She whispered, "Please let me through," but her voice was swallowed by their mocking. And then the laughter died. From the edge of the street, a figure approached, tall, broad-shouldered, with a hat pulled low against the sun. His boots struck the earth with a steady rhythm, each step heavier than words. The crowd shifted, unease rippling through them. Clara looked up, heart pounding. It was a cowboy, rugged, silent, carrying an air of solitude like a second skin. His coat was worn, his hands rough from work, and across his jaw ran a faint scar, a mark that hinted at battles fought and survived. His eyes, when they met hers, were steady, unreadable, but not cruel. The heckler tried to laugh again, though his voice faltered. "Just a joke, stranger. Ain't it funny?" The cowboy stopped between Clara and the men. For a long, breathless moment, he said nothing. Silence pressed heavy on the air, louder than any insult. Finally, his voice came low, gravel rough but firm. "You don't deserve this." The words were simple, but they struck Clara harder than any insult ever had. Her chest tightened, her breath catching as if she had forgotten how to breathe. No one had defended her before. No one had told her she didn't deserve it. The men muttered, shifting uncomfortably. Something in the cowboy's stillness, the weight of his presence, made it clear he wasn't a man to be tested. One by one, they stepped back, their mockery drying up like rain in the desert. The street grew quiet again. Clara clutched her shawl, her heart racing. She didn't know this man, didn't even know his name, but already something stirred inside her, confusion, disbelief, a fragile flicker of hope. Who was he, this silent stranger who had stepped into her shame, without asking for anything in return? The cowboy turned to her then, his voice quieter this time, almost gentle. "Go on," he said, tilting his head toward the mercantile. "You're safe." Clara nodded, unable to speak. She hurried past, her step shaky but lighter somehow, as though his words had carried some of her burden away. From the doorway of the mercantile, she glanced back once. The stranger was still there, standing in the dust, shoulders squared against the world. His silence was not empty. It was full, strong, a shield that somehow reached her even from across the street. Clara didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything began to change. The stranger with grief in his eyes and silence on his tongue had stepped into her life, and nothing would ever be the same. The day's errands finished, Clara lingered in the corner of the mercantile, clutching her small bag of flour as if it were a lifeline. She had nowhere to go, no family to return to, no home waiting for her. The room seemed to close in with every whisper behind her back. Her eyes burned, her throat dry. She had survived another day, but survival felt emptier than death when loneliness shadowed every step. She stepped outside, squinting into the harsh sunlight. The stranger was still there, standing near his horse as if the world had paused for him alone. He didn't call out, didn't smile, just adjusted the reins with slow, steady hands. Clara tried to pass without a word, but her steps faltered when his voice, low, calm, broke the silence. "You'll be safe at my ranch." Clara froze. The words felt unreal, almost a trick. No one had ever offered her safety without a price. She turned to him, startled, searching his face for mockery. But his eyes were steady, unreadable, like deep water that reflected nothing but strength. Her voice trembled. "Why would you? You don't even know me." The cowboy shifted, glancing briefly toward the horizon before meeting her gaze again. No one deserves to be left alone. That was all he said, but it was enough. He motioned toward the wagon hitched nearby. The boards were worn, the seat creaked, but it stood like an invitation. Clara hesitated, every instinct screaming that men always wanted something in return. And yet, there was something different about this one. Something in his stillness, his silence, that felt more trustworthy than 100 honey promises. Finally, she climbed up into the seat, clutching her bag like a shield. He took the reins, wordless, and the wagon jolted forward. The road stretched before them, endless desert marked by sagebrush and distant mesas. The wheels creaked. The horses snorted, and silence wrapped around them like a heavy cloak. Clara stared at the horizon, her heart pounding in the stillness. The awkwardness pressed in, thick as the dust that rose behind the wagon. She stole glances at the man beside her. His jaw was set, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He said nothing, asked nothing, yet his presence filled the air like quiet thunder. The desert itself seemed to mirror them both, vast, empty, scarred by harsh winds, yet holding a raw kind of beauty. Clara felt the symbolism ache in her bones. Two broken souls traveling the same barren road, side by side yet worlds apart. Her fingers tightened on her shawl. Why would a stranger care? The question circled her mind like a vulture. Was this real? Or would his kindness crumble the way everyone else's had, turning into cruelty, demands, or abandonment? But when she risked one more glance at him, she saw no hunger in his gaze, no judgment, only quiet steadiness, as if offer her shelter wasn't a choice to him, but a principle carved into his very being. The sun dipped lower, painting the desert sky in fire and gold. Clara exhaled slowly, the first breath of fragile relief she had taken in years. The wagon rattled on, carrying her toward an uncertain future. But for the first time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be one she faced alone. The wagon rattled up the long, dusty trail until a ranch finally appeared against the fading light. It wasn't grand, just a weathered cabin with a small barn, a corral, and wide fields stretching toward the horizon. Yet to Clara, who had known only rejection and closed doors, it looked like something out of a dream, a place that wasn't meant for her, yet somehow she had arrived. The cowboy, still silent, climbed down and offered his hand. For a moment, she hesitated, then placed her trembling fingers in his. His grip was steady but not possessive, guiding rather than claiming. He led her toward the cabin, the scent of pine wood mixing with the faint smell of horses carried by the evening wind. Inside, the air was simple wooden beams, a stone hearth, shelves lined with neatly stacked supplies. It wasn't wealth that defined this place, but order, quiet strength. Clara lingered near the doorway, feeling as if she might shatter the fragile peace just by breathing. He walked ahead, opened the door, and motioned her inside. The room was small, but it carried a tenderness she hadn't expected. Clean sheets laid out on a wooden bed, a folded quilt at the foot, and a small table where a lantern flickered softly. Every detail whispered of preparation, as if he wanted this place to be welcoming, not merely functional. Clara's throat tightened. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had given her something without a hidden cost. She brushed her fingers over the quilt, overwhelmed by the care behind it. Before she could speak, his voice broke the silence, deep and steady. "You owe me nothing." Her head snapped up, stunned. No man had ever said those words to her before. Every place she had lived, every roof she had hidden under, came with chains, spoken or unspoken. Yet here, he was giving her a room, a bed, safety, and asking nothing in return. Tears threatened, unbidden and unwanted. "Why?" Her voice cracked. Why would you give me this?" He didn't look at her, just adjusted the lantern wick until the flame steadied. "Because you need a place to rest. That's all." For a long moment, silence filled the room. The only sound was the faint howl of wind outside and the slow crackle of the hearth beyond the doorway. Clara lowered her gaze, gripping the edge of the bed as if it might disappear. Her heart warred between disbelief and a fragile hope she barely dared to feel. When he finally stepped back, his boots heavy on the wood, he paused at the door. His voice came again low and calm. "You're safe here." Then he left, closing the door gently behind him. Clara sat on the bed, her hands buried in the quilt, her body trembling with the weight of something she had never known before. Safety without condition. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the night. The ranch outside seemed lonely, yes, but not in the cruel way of abandonment. It was a quiet kind of solitude, the kind that healed instead of wounded. The walls did not press in on her. The silence did not mock her. Here, in this small, simple room, she could breathe, laying back against the pillow. She closed her eyes, whispering to herself words she had never believed she would feel again. Maybe I am not unwanted after all. The night stretched long and quiet at the ranch, the kind of silence that could either soothe or suffocate. For Clara, it was the latter. Sleep didn't come easily, not when her mind was filled with the voices of the past, cruel and sharp as barbed wire. She could still hear them. Ugly, unwanted, cursed. Each word clung to her like a scar she could never peel away. She rose from bed, her bare feet pressing against the wooden floor, and found herself before the small mirror hanging on the wall. The glass was warped, imperfect, but it showed enough. Her reflection stared back, pale, worn, eyes shadowed by years of rejection. Her gaze fell to the faint scar that cut across her cheek, one she had been mocked for since childhood. She lifted her hand as though to cover it, but stopped. Hiding never made it go away. The memory of her fiancé leaving her returned sharp and merciless, his eyes filled with disgust, his voice cold as he said, "No man wants to wake up beside a ghost." That day, something inside her had shattered, and though time had passed, the shards still pierced her every time she remembered. A soft creak outside the door broke through her thoughts. Clara froze, half expecting anger or intrusion. Instead, when she opened the door just enough to glance into the hallway, she found no one. Only a tray of food resting on the floor, a simple bowl of stew, still warm, and a piece of bread beside it. A folded blanket lay neatly across the tray, its edges tucked with quiet care. Her breath caught. He hadn't knocked, hadn't demanded, hadn't even lingered. He had simply left what she might need and walked away. For long moments she stood frozen, her heart torn between suspicion and something unfamiliar, gratitude. Slowly, almost cautiously, she bent down and gathered the tray into her arms. When she sat on the small table inside her room, she stared at it as though it were some impossible gift. Why would he do this? The cowboy owed her nothing, yet his actions carried a weight she couldn't ignore. Not pity, not charity, but something gentler. Respect. That night, she didn't eat much, just a few careful bites of stew. But even that small acceptance felt like crossing an invisible line, one she had built around herself for years. She had accepted something without debt, without fear. Later, when the lamp burned low and shadows flickered against the walls, she wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, and the warmth seeped into her bones in a way she hadn't felt in so long. She sat there, clutching it, tears welling unbidden. Outside, she could hear the cowboy moving around the barn, the quiet rhythm of chores, the creak of the wood. He didn't look in, didn't press her, didn't speak. But somehow, his silence was louder than any word she'd ever heard. For the first time in years, Clara felt the smallest crack in her armor, a sliver of trust, fragile and uncertain, yet real. She whispered into the stillness, though no one heard, "Thank you." And when she finally lay down to rest, with the blanket wrapped around her and the tray beside her bed, the voices of the past seemed just a little quieter. Morning sunlight spilled across the ranch, golden rays washing over the wide fields and weather fences. Clara stood on the porch, the blanket from last night still around her shoulders, watching as the cowboy moved through his chores. His steps were steady, his movements purposeful, feeding horses, checking saddles, hauling hay. There was no rush, no complaint, just a quiet strength that filled the silence. She had lived around men before, loud, demanding, quick to anger, but he was nothing like them. He worked without asking for praise, and when a horse bucked against the reins, he calmed it with a low, steady voice. His presence seemed to command respect without ever raising his tone. Clara didn't realize she had stepped off the porch until she was standing closer, drawn to the rhythm of his work. The cowboy looked up, his eyes briefly meeting hers. For a moment, She thought he might send her back inside, remind her that she was a guest. Instead, he simply nodded toward the small bucket of feed resting by the fence. Without a word, she picked it up and carried it toward the pen. Her hands trembled slightly and used to this kind of work, but she managed. The horses sniffed curiously, and one nudged her arm, startling her into a nervous laugh. The cowboy's gaze softened. "You're fine," he said, his voice low but steady. Then, almost as if it mattered deeply, he added, "Thank you." The words unsettled her. She wasn't used to gratitude, not for small things, not for simply trying. But the way he said it, as though her effort was worth acknowledging, made something inside her chest loosen. As the days stretched on, Clara found herself helping in small ways. She held the wooden post steady while he hammered nails into a broken section of the fence. She carried buckets of water to trough, her arms aching but her heart strangely light. Each time, the cowboy never let her effort go unspoken. Appreciated. Good work. Simple words, but honest. Later, as the sun began to sink, they sat by the barn. The cowboy wiped the sweat from his brow, leaned against the wall, and finally broke the silence. "I protect," he said, his voice carrying a weight she couldn't ignore. His eyes, shadowed by lost yet steady as stone, locked on hers. "I don't hurt." Clara froze. For years, men's words had been weapons, used to cut her down, bind her, remind her she was less. But here he was, laying down a principle, not just for himself, but for her to believe. "Why?" she whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. He looked out over the land, the fading sunlight painting the sky in shades of fire. "Because I know what it feels like," he said simply. No explanation followed, no demand for her to understand. Just a truth, spoken plain and quiet. Clara didn't push. She didn't need to. She could feel the unspoken grief in his tone, the echo of losses he carried just as she carried her own. That night, as she sat in her small room, she thought about the day. The food, the blanket, the work, the words. He asked for nothing, yet gave respect freely. For the first time, the thought crossed her mind, maybe not all men were cruel. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't even safety she fully trusted. But it was a beginning fragile and real. The first foundation of trust, laid not with promises, but with simple actions and a code that spoke louder than any vow. And as Clara drifted into sleep, the voices of her past seemed quieter still, replaced by the memory of a steady voice. "I protect, I don't hurt." The days on the ranch began to find their rhythm. Morning light through thin curtains, the smell of hay carried on a breeze, the steady sound of boots against dirt. Clara had never known such quiet, but it was no longer an emptiness that frightened her. It was a silence that slowly began to soothe her. One afternoon, determined to be useful, Clara tried cooking for them. The cowboy had left in the kitchen while he tended to the barn, and she thought, how hard can it be? But soon enough, smoke curled from pan, the biscuits burned black on the edges, and a startled yelp escaped her lips when hot grease popped and landed on her wrist. The door creaked, and he stepped in, pausing at the sight of her red cheeks and the disaster on the stove. For a moment, she feared he would scold her. Instead, the corner of his mouth lifted. Barely, but enough to notice. "Guess the stove won that fight," he said quietly. Clara blinked at him, then at the charred biscuits, and before she could stop herself, a laugh slipped out. A soft, uncertain laugh at first, like she'd forgotten how it sounded. But then it grew, bubbling up until it filled the small kitchen. The cowboy said nothing. He just leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her. And though his expression remained calm, his eyes softened in a way that made her chest ache. Later that week, she found herself in the pasture, trying to scatter feed for the chickens. They had other ideas, chasing after her skirt, flapping wings, and clucking loudly. Clara squealed and tried to shoo them away, but only managed to trip, spilling the entire bucket into the dirt. She landed in the dust, breathless and laughing again, even as the chickens pecked happily at the feast. From across the fence, the cowboy's low chuckle joined hers. It wasn't loud. It never was. But the sound warmed her more than the sun overhead. She looked up, brushing dust from her dress, and saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not pity, not distance, but something gentler. It wasn't just the animals or the accidents. It was the way she felt the air shift when she laughed, as if the weight on her chest lifted piece by piece. She hadn't realized how starved she was for lightness, for the freedom to make mistakes without punishment, to laugh without fear of mockery. That evening, as they sat on the porch, the sky painted with streaks of purple and gold, Clara caught herself smiling for no reason. The cowboy noticed, his gaze steady on her, before drifting back toward the horizon. He didn't speak, but the silence between them was different now, warmer, filled with something unspoken. For Clara, it was the first time in years she felt sparks of life stirring inside her. For the cowboy, it was a quiet joy of watching a broken soul begin to heal. And though neither said it aloud, both knew the truth. Something had shifted. The ranch, once a place of sorrow and solitude, now carried the faint sound of laughter, hers. And in that sound, his heart began to soften. The peace of the ranch couldn't hold forever. Clara had almost convinced herself the outside world would forget her, but whispers have a way of crawling back. When she accompanied the cowboy into town for supplies, she felt the shift immediately. The stares, the muttered voices that followed her down the dirt street. That's her. One woman hissed to another, eyes narrowing. The broken girl, the one her own kin cast aside. Clara's throat tightened. She tried to keep her head down, clutching the basket in her hands as though it could shield her, but the words sank like stones into her chest. No matter how far she thought she had come, the past followed her footsteps like a shadow. At the general store, the whispers grew sharper. A man snickered, loud enough for her to hear. Guess the cursed girl found herself a fool to take her in? The cowboy beside her stilled. His silence was heavy, like a storm about to break. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene, but the way he shifted closer, broad shoulders casting her in his shadow, was enough to silence the laughter. The mocker looked away quickly, subtly busying himself with a barrel of nails. Still, Clara's heart was racing when they stepped back onto the boardwalk. She thought it was over, until she saw them, two figures waiting near the hitching post. Her breath froze. Familiar faces, one she thought she'd never see again. Relatives who had once called her a burden, a curse. The same people who had left her to fend for herself when she had needed them most. Well, one of them drawled, a cruel smile twisting his lips. Look who's thriving after all. You've been hiding out here, girl. You belong with your kin. Clara shook her head, fear clamping down on her chest. No, I don't. The second relative stepped forward, eyes cold. You think you can just walk away from family? You're coming with us. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Her hands trembled, the urge to run war with the old, familiar dread. They had power once. They had broken her before. And the townsfolk gathered, curious but silent, unwilling to interfere. Then the cowboy moved. He stepped between Clara and the men, his presence a wall of quiet strength. His hat shadowed his eyes, but his voice was steady, low, and filled with iron. She's not leaving, he said. Not while I breathe. The words cut through the air like a blade. Simple but final, the kind of vow that made men hesitate, even cruel ones. The relative sneered, bluster faltering in the face of his calm. She's blood. You can't just... I said. The cowboy interrupted, voice quiet but unyielding. She's not leaving. The silence that followed was thicker than gun smoke. The crowd of onlookers shifted nervously, sensing the weight of his stance. It wasn't bluster, wasn't empty. It was the kind of promise a man like him kept, no matter the cost. Clara's breath caught. Never in her life had someone stood so firmly for her. She felt the sting of tears blur her vision as she watched him face down the ghosts of her past without fear. Her relatives muttered curses, finally retreating under the weight of his steady gaze. But Clara knew this wasn't the end. Shadows had a way of returning, even when chased away. As they climbed into the wagon, her hands still shook, but when she glanced at him, the cowboy was calm, rein steady in his grip, and though he didn't speak another word, Clara understood what he had given her. Protection, safety, and For the first time in her life, a reason to believe she was worth defending. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but Clara's mind was a storm. The whispers of the townsfolk clung to her, the cruel faces of her relatives etched like scars in her memory. Every bump of the wagon wheels echoed with the old words she thought she had buried. Unwanted, cursed, broken. By the time they reached the ranch, her chest was so tight she could hardly breathe. She tried to hide it, slipping quickly into the room he had given her, closing the door as though it could hold back the flood. But when the silence pressed too hard, she collapsed against the bed, shaking. The tears she had held back in town poured freely, breaking her open. When the door creaked softly, she looked up. The cowboy stood there, hat in hand, his eyes shadowed with concern. He didn't speak right away. He never did. But his presence was steady, patient, like the earth beneath her feet. Her voice cracked through sobs. "Why would you fight for someone like me?" The words tumbled out, raw and desperate. "All my life, I've been nothing but a burden. They told me I was cursed. They left me to die. And yet you stood there as if I was worth something. Why?" For a moment, the only sound was her uneven breathing. Then he stepped closer, kneeling so that he was eye level with her. His hand, rough from ranch work, rested gently over hers. His voice, low and steady, carried more weight than 100 speeches. "Because you matter," he said. The words pierced her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Simple, but undeniable. He didn't try to explain away her scars, didn't deny her past. He only gave her a truth she had never been told before, that she mattered. Her tears slowed, trembling on her lashes as she searched his face. There was no pity there, no hidden agenda, only a quiet strength that asked for nothing in return. Then, without ceremony, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bundle. Unwrapping it, he revealed a delicate silver locket, its surface worn but polished, clearly something he had kept safe for years. He placed it gently into her palm. "You'll never walk in fear again," he murmured. Her fingers closed around the locket, as though it was a lifeline. The weight of it felt heavier than gold. It was a vow, not a possession, but a protection. Clara's breath hitched as fresh tears spilled, not of despair, but of something entirely new, hope. She had never been given a gift without strings, never been told she was safe. Overcome, she leaned forward, hesitating for just a moment before letting herself collapse into his arms. For the first time in her life, she didn't fear rejection. His arms wrapped around her, strong and steady, holding her as if she wasn't fragile, but cherished. In that embrace, the walls she had built around her heart cracked, then fell. She trusted him, not because of his words, but because of his actions, because of the silent vow he had made and kept. The night stretched quiet around them, the crackle of the fire the only sound. But in her heart, Clara knew a truth she had long thought impossible. She was not broken beyond repair. She was not unwanted. In his silence, she had been chosen. The days that followed unfolded gently, like a slow dawn after a long storm. The ranch, once silent and heavy with loneliness, began to change. The horses seemed livelier, their hooves beating joy into the dusty earth. Wildflowers started blooming along the fence line, painting splashes of color across the land. Even the air carried a new kind of sweetness, as though the earth itself was healing alongside her. Clara noticed a change within herself most of all. Where fear had once ruled her, a new calm had begun to grow. She woke each morning not with dread, but with a quiet anticipation of another day lived freely. Her hands, once trembling with hesitation, now worked steadily alongside his, mending fences, carrying pails of water, planting seeds. For the first time in her life, she felt useful without being used. The cowboy never made grand declarations, but his actions spoke in ways that words never could. He thanked her after every small task, no matter how insignificant. He made sure her seat at the table was never empty, her plate always full. And at night, when the shadows threatened to creep back into her heart, she would hear the steady sound of his boots on the porch, keeping watch, not because he had to, but because he chose to. One evening, while tending the corral, Clara caught herself laughing, a true, unguarded laugh that rang across the land. She had slipped in the mud and ended up with straw in her hair, But instead of shame, she felt lighthearted. When she turned, she found him leaning against the fence, watching her with a quiet smile. The sight made her breath catch. She realized then that he wasn't just a protector. He was a reason her spirit had come alive again. Days melted into weeks, and slowly, the broken girl who once hid from the world began to vanish. In her place stood a woman who could meet her own reflection without flinching. The scars were still there, etched across her skin and memory, but they no longer defined her. She was no longer the girl mocked, unwanted, or abandoned. She was Clara, the woman who had survived, who had found a place, a purpose, and most of all, a love she had never dared to dream of. One morning, the sky blushed with the colors of dawn, gold, pink, and soft lavender stretching across the horizon. Clara stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards cool beneath her bare feet. The world was still, the only sound the soft chirp of waking birds. The cowboy stood there already, as if he had been waiting for her. She moved beside him, and without hesitation his hand found hers. His touch was steady, grounding, warm. They stood together, watching the sun rise over the ranch, the light spilling across the fields like a promise. For the first time, Clara didn't feel like a guest or a burden or a shadow. She felt like she belonged. Her heart swelled as she realized the truth. She was not broken anymore. She was cherished. Every smile he gave her, every kindness, every unspoken vow had pieced her back together in ways she never thought possible. The cowboy turned slightly, his gaze soft but unshakable. He didn't need to say the words. She could see them in the way he looked at her, in the way his thumb brushed gently across her knuckles. She answered not with words either, but with a smile that reached her soul. The rising sun bathed them in golden light, wrapping the ranch in warmth. In that moment, Clara knew her journey had come full circle. She had been left broken by the world, cast aside and forgotten. But here in the quiet strength of his gentle hand, she had found not just safety, but love. And as the light of morning crowned them both, her story closed with a truth that would forever remain. Left broken by the world, she never expected it. But in his gentle hand, she found a love that healed her completely.